This program deals with devil worship and satanic beliefs. It contains explicit scenes and descriptions of violent crimes and rituals.
Americans are asking, who attacked our country?
The plan is not living jihad against the United States. Can you tell us why?
Everything pertaining to what's happening has never come to the surface. The world will never know the true facts of what occurred, my motives.
And night fell in a different world.
And Iblis is thinking, I should be getting this position, not Adam, and this guy is created from dirt.
And how does the army feel about you being head of the temple of Set?
And the conspiracy theorists can say what they will, but
I want you to give me power over Adam, and I want you to give me soldiers and minions and all of these things.
The people have so much to gain and have such an material motive for putting a position on me. They'll never let the true facts come aboard to the world.
And I want you to be able to give me the ability to whisper into the hearts of mankind.
And who was the grotto leader? Don't remember the name. You don't remember the name of a person who involved you in murder?
Now these people are in very high positions,
Yes. Welcome back to Subliminal Jihad, episode 84. I'm your co-host, Dimitri.
I'm Khalid.
And today, we have a very special guest joining us to talk about some very interesting and dark topics from American history in the 1970s. We have with us Joe Green. Joe, are you there?
I'm here. How's it going?
It's great. Very happy to have you here. So we reached out to invite you on to talk about a few things. I think the biggest thing we will get into today is the entire phenomenon of Jonestown and the People's Temple. But I know I've heard you before. I became aware of you. I think I heard you on Ed Opperman a couple of times over the years, and always really enjoyed your appearances there. And I know that you were a very knowledgeable researcher on a lot of these topics that come up pretty often on Subliminal Jihad. So I guess if you'd like to maybe introduce yourself a little bit in your background and kind of how you got into these topics.
Yeah, sure. The sort of short answer is that one was 9/11, because that changed how I viewed almost everything, because of how clearly problematic the cover story was in that happening. It was like, are you guys serious? Like, this is for real? And the other thing that happened was I was hired to write a screenplay for this guy who was making an independent film in Austin. I live in Texas. I live in San Antonio. And but at the time I was living in Austin. This guy wanted to make this independent picture. I write plays, and I'm a writer of different things. And so he hired me to write this thing, but he wanted me to do some investigation into the Kennedy assassination because he wanted it to tie into the story that he wanted me to tell. And I was like, okay, sure. So he gave me a couple of books. And having grown up in an academic family, my father's a professor, retired professor of history. I had never taken, quote unquote, conspiracy theories very seriously. And so I read these books and I was like, well, geez, this isn't lunacy. This is fairly logical, actually. This is just the kind of analysis I would expect to read in, anything, in sociology or anything else. It just so happens to be about a taboo subject. And then having realized that, I then read a book called Secret and Suppressed, which had an article by John Judge called The Black Hole of Guyana. And that article took the top of my head off, because this was a highly academic work with 175 footnotes for a 12-page article. And it completely turned around what Jonestown was. I assumed, like everybody else, that Jonestown was, who drank the Kool-Aid and all that stuff. And and none of that is true. Almost nothing about what people are told about Jonestown is true. And so I said, I gotta meet this guy. And at the time, the Coalition on Political Assassinations was having meetings every year in Dallas on typically around November 22nd. And so I just drove up there. I drove up to Dallas. I met John Judge in the breakfast room of what was then the Hotel Lawrence, and fortunately now it's like La Quinta or something. And we talked for a few hours, and he completely took my head off about every subject imaginable. And after that, I was in. And so I kind of became his right-hand man, I guess you would say. I would just started helping out COPA whenever I could, and every year I would go to the conferences, and I got to meet all these people, and some of them became my friends. And there were other people like, Randy Benson, who was making a documentary about John at that time, and which I ended up being the research consultant on, a film called The Searchers, and other folks that have become my friends that I talk to all the time. And so I helped John on various things until he died, unfortunately, in 2014, right after the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination, and in the middle of a project where I was helping to make a film about the Kennedy assassination, and also a Hollywood motion picture about it, because I'd gotten hired by this other group, which is another long story. I think I would say that in general, as a researcher, one of the things that I've tried to do in all of my work is to call back to a procedure of investigation that is birthed from John Judge, because he was my mentor, and his mentor, Mae Brussel, and Penn Jones, and Robert Cutler. That is, if you're making a family tree of researchers, that is my tree. I go back to Mae Brussel, and so she's like my grandma, even though I never met her.
That's a very strong conspiracy oak to be a branch of, I would say. Yeah, that's very cool. We're big fans of Mae Brussel on Subliminal Jihad. You might have heard before, and I definitely see that lineage in your work, the stuff I've read of yours, and the way you talk about this stuff. And I think that's really cool. I mean, even Khalid and I have, to a certain degree, like a little bit of like an arts background, and in Khalid's case, an academic background. And I can say it was through working on some screenplays that I got sucked into some of these topics by just researching them in earnest, to look for, hey, what's the most compelling thing, what really happened, and all that stuff. And then when you start to turn over some of these rocks, it starts to, you can't really I mean, maybe a lot of people can unsee it, or they can compartmentalize it, or just, it's like seeing a ghost when they were a kid. They just kind of, put it away in their brain. But I don't know, for me, it definitely sounds like for you, once you discovered certain things, these were ontologically disruptive things that kind of made it hard to put back inside of Pandora's box. And I feel like it has to influence like any kind of written or literary or artistic work that you do, right?
Yes, definitely. And I've written about this a little bit in, I don't remember if it was Dissenting Views 1 or 2, but I've written about it, about what I call the academic mindset. Because when I first saw the film JFK, the Oliver Stone picture, it was in 1992, I think it was. So I was 21, right? So I was still in college. And when I saw the film, I thought it was a terrific movie. I thought, man, this is a great movie. But it never occurred to me to treat any of its theses literally. Like I just said, this is an example of a film that posits a conspiracy in the assassination of President Kennedy, and does so in this incredibly artistic and in the aesthetic tradition of like Russian films, with the montage, and so I said, okay, and so all I did was I categorized it, and I came to understand later that comes from academic training, because that's basically what you do. Is you see things and you categorize them, and you go, okay, that's an example of that. But at a certain level,
that's so, yeah.
But if you're not directly working on that thing, like that is not your field of expertise, you go, oh, that's an example of that, and you sort of move on.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just thinking about that the other day. I was talking with some people the other day about Thomas Pynchon and in particular his most recent novel Bleeding Edge, and how we were discussing it, with all of the subterranean kind of connections and links that he makes even between like the early internet and like 9/11 and all this other stuff. And I think once you read enough Pynchon books, at least at this point in my life, it is so painfully obvious to me that he is basically what you would call a quote-unquote conspiracy theorist or a conspiracy believer, a truther, if you will. But he kind of works it into his novels in a very interesting kind of sub rosa kind of way. But I was discussing with some other people like how the literary establishment and say, the New York Times book review or whatever, they almost have this way of being able to like not notice that. Like they miss the forest for the trees with Pynchon, and they focus on his sense of wackiness, his postmodern deconstructionalist kind of tendencies, or he's just like having fun with the notion that we can't know everything that's happening. But it's like I'm reading it, I'm like, no, he literally knows that like some kind of WASP faction of the CIA killed JFK. He knows about Bobby Kennedy. He makes jokes about it that you can kind of notice, and he's very up on. And I think the same about 9/11. And it's kind of fascinating, though, how, like, even something as literal as JFK, here's a movie about how forces in the government, like, hatched a conspiracy to murder the president, got away with it. People can still look and be like, yeah, well, it's not, like, literally true. But it's like, well, then how, I don't know, like, how are you not outraged by the movie in some way? It's a little bit, it's an odd form of compartmentalization that can happen a lot in American culture. And it even ties weirdly, I don't know if that has some kind of weird influence to like Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the Tarantino movie from a couple years ago that like literally rewrites like the kind of admittedly, very rickety official story of the Manson murders as like this kind of like revenge fantasy thing. And I remember talking to people that had seen it and kind of liked the movie. I'm maybe like younger people, like closer to young millennials or Zoomers that are like kind of like, oh, that's not what happened. You know what I mean? Like, they don't even know the regular story. And so it's like, I was very angry at that movie for doing that. It's like, I kind of got what he was doing, but it was like, dude, you're right after Chaos comes out, you're going to put out this fucking movie, and then just kind of be like totally buy into the Vincent Bugliosi bullshit about it and totally just like add another layer of unreality on top of it. That's going to make it even harder for people to like dig down and see like what was really going. So it's a hefty challenge we have for ourselves, I think, from academia across to the arts. If you want to talk about these subjects, like it's weird how people can kind of turn off their brain or like not notice something, even if you're practically putting it like in their face. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was just saying that, I was reading this article that Dimitri had dug up. I think it was sort of an older article that was published in, I guess, a journal about popular culture that had to do with, it was called Reconstructing Reality, Conspiracy Theories About Jonestown. And, the article went over a bunch of different theories about the events of Jonestown. And, it kind of spoke out of both sides of its mouth in certain ways. Rebecca Moore is the author. And, on one hand, it was saying there are many mysteries about the events of Jonestown. I'm not trying to say that I have a clear, definitive picture of what happened. But, the problem with these conspiracy theories, and, she mentions John Judge, among others, that run the gamut, some being like they were good socialists and it was all a cover-up, they were all, killed because they were, really, a good revolutionary socialist organization to, something, more along the lines that it was a CIA mind control experiment, an idea that I think that maybe we're all more partial to. But she would then say, these conspiracy theories actually are quite rigorous and are quite plausible. There's nothing really about them that is, absurd per se. Her problem was that they seem to create, she was saying they make a world where, there's a scapegoat or something, or that it allows us to not deal with the evil in humanity because we can blame it on the conspirators. And it's like, well, the conspirators in most cases are human, certainly everything that they do, any other human being is theoretically capable of. They're not like the main, certainly in these conspiracies about Jonestown, there aren't usually supernatural or, demonic elements at play. But it's kind of just like a bunch of stock lines about the idea of conspiracy, but that one like sort of falls back on. But under scrutiny, they don't really hold up. Like, these are just alternative narratives that really are a lot of the time just as plausible as whatever the mainstream narrative is. They're just not that narrative.
Yeah, it reminds me of the cliche. I think I even heard it as soon as, like, within the last 5 days. I think I've seen somebody either posting it about the RFK assassination or 9/11, which is that, well, conspiracy theories are appealing to people because they offer a simple narrative that is just a little bit more comforting than the messy, random, chaotic reality of, like, whatever the official story is. And I'm like, I feel like that is completely backwards. I don't know about you, Joe.
That there's no room for ambiguity. Again, the conspiracy theory has just become like a completely floating signifier that like, I don't know, terrorism or something like that, that really just means nothing. And certainly doesn't have anything to do with like the actual literal meaning of a conspiracy, i.e. a group of people like working together to achieve a goal that's often concealed from others. It's just like this bizarre floating signifier, of like, a narrative without ambiguity, which of course isn't really true of most things that are considered to be conspiracy theories, and are dismissed as such.
And that's sort of I would say an intellectual response, or an attempt at an intellectual response to conspiracy theories. And what I've tried to do in the past in my work is point out that we have this enormous covert apparatus at our disposal that historians agree was used to take out, like, Jacob Arbenz, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I just lost the name. But anyway,
Allende in Chile.
Yes, like Salvador Allende, exactly. Salvador Allende, and in Iraq, and all these different things going all the way back to 47 in Greece. And then all through the 50s in the Middle East. So we've been doing all this stuff, but apparently it stops domestically. So,
it's interesting how there's always a horizon of like comprehension. Like something that we bring up on the show a lot is a little passage in Carl Oglesby's book where he was talking to like a group of people, and they were like, how can you say there's a conspiracy at the highest levels, and then he just kind of asked them, like, as a thought experiment, well, what about like your own jobs, your own work environments? Like, and then they would just like go on at length about how, there are all this like backroom deals and like backstabbing and blackmail. And like there's copious examples of things that like come to light, but before certain sources of authority have like put a stamp on it as something that's real, or like when it passes a certain horizon, like, these sort of ceremonially, awesome or majestic aspects of the government or like our own culture or something, it then becomes unthinkable. It's very, sorry, but
it's the notion that like as evil as people in government and business and everything could be, like they wouldn't kill 3,000 of their own citizens in downtown Manhattan, would they? That's just too far. That they would not, there's I think there's a real like hard psychological barrier with a lot of just regular Americans where like there's something like you can kind of believe it that, okay, yeah, we trained death squads in Central America in the 80s and overthrew 40 governments, et cetera, but would we come back? Would we allow the chickens to come home back to roost just the way we did? But then when we get into the topic we're focusing on today, would the U.S. government play an active role in, say, the murder of about 900 American citizens? Regardless of whether they're in the borders of the United States when it happened, I don't know. Like in this case, it seems like somebody was more than willing or thought it was necessary to do so. So,
that was an interesting aspect of that Rebecca Moore article too. She was saying that people couldn't deal with the idea that like people would commit suicide. And so therefore, like, they had to deal with the ridiculous idea that, like, 900 people will be killed. But that, obviously makes no sense. Like, I don't think that anyone really finds it absurd that someone would commit suicide. Or, and she was suggesting that, like, it would be crazy to think, and I don't necessarily know if, like, the theory that she was disputing is true or whatever, but she was saying like, oh, how absurd to say that 900 people would die just for the sake of protecting or, doing damage to one person. Just like, I'm like, are you kidding me? These lives like of certain people mean nothing to a lot of people. Like the average American's life is like, their conveniences are like built in the back of so much brutality and misery around the world. Like it just, but anyway, sorry.
You're pointing out I think that the critical issue there is it's armchair theorizing. And I think that quote unquote conspiracy theories or researchers or parapolitical folks get accused of being armchair theorists. But in fact, the reason that somebody becomes a quote unquote conspiracy theorist is because they actually did some reading. Nobody starts out that way, right? Wanting to overthrow the history that they were taught in school. It's just that when they start to go look at newspapers of the time or documents from the government, they discover, oh, crap, like none of this was true. And you become, therefore, critical of the official government stories in all of these different situations. We don't just invent stuff. The classic one with Jonestown, I mean, literally a year before anything happened at Jonestown, Mae Brussel said that it was an MK Ultra camp for training assassins. Okay, and Mae had figured that out from reading newspapers. And because she knew,
it's amazing what she was able to nail at the time it was happening with all these cases just by researching things.
Because she knew who the players were. It's like, oh, that's not good. If Jim Jones is down in Guyana, that means bad things are happening.
And that was something that I was thinking in relation to Pynchon the other day, that like all the characters, there's a few characters in the novel Bleeding Edge right after 9/11 happens that are immediately like, this is the Reichstag fire, this is Bush and his gang, they knew this was going to happen, they probably were instrumental in it happening, and they're going to go rampage across the Middle East, and by the way, the internet is going to become a tool of control, of command and control, blah blah blah. And it's like, even if we allow that the official narrative of 9/11 is 100% true, the paranoid conspiracy theorists in that novel end up being way more correct about what's about to happen in the coming decade than everybody else who isn't one, who is basically just stunned and kind of dissociated by 9/11 and very passive and kind of allows like the Bush administration base, even if they're a liberal, like kind of lets them run rampant because you aren't armed with like this knowledge already to be like, hey, wait a minute. And so I think in a sense, it's kind of like people always talk about, can we afford in a free democratic society to just allow all this conspiracy theorizing to just float around? And it's kind of like, well, in some ways, like, can we afford not to be a little paranoid about the people that have the most power? Because even if you're not 100% like bullseye accurate with all the facts, or you don't have all the facts yet, if you're basing your assumptions off of research that you've done that you can, rely on as like true, like say if you know everything about Iran-Contra, if you've read a ton of shit about Iran-Contra, and then you look at like the Bush gang and you look at 9/11, I don't know, they executed like a vast right-wing conspiracy over the course of the 80s and then basically pretty much, even though they almost got caught like through a stroke of luck by some Sandinista rocket launcher, like they ultimately all got away with it. So should we absolutely approach like the Bush administration with just the supreme presumption of innocence when something like 9/11 happens, and then they start, they fire up the war machine and go off and do what they do? So I think like, even the speculation, and I think it's like important obviously to be honest when you don't have the facts, like, we don't want to be Alex Jones here and just like assert things, without kind of evidence or go like way too far. But I do think like the speculative process is actually like really fruitful and important, and I think it gets you closer to the truth than, I don't know, a lot of these like academics who are just, erming left and right and trying to find an intellectualized, like respectable way to say that this isn't important, or,
Sure. Well, and what gives a lie to all of it is that it is perfectly acceptable to reason in a conspiratorial way as long as you're talking about Vladimir Putin.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Oh, yes. We've noticed.
Yes,
yeah, absolutely. My
Yeah.
God. I mean, I think that if there was a novel that came out that said Vladimir Putin did 9/11, like it would get like a huge spot on MSNBC, and like, they'd probably think it was cool or something. But yeah, no, it's bizarre how that's happened now.
I was just reading yesterday, like an article on the NYT that was about, like, it was actually interesting because, of course, like the writers who, the journalists of the New York Times and the editorial board, like, are not a monolith or anything, but they kind of indicted themselves in a way because it was about the sort of FBI whistleblower, not, who, he had been in the FBI in Minneapolis and earlier than that, I think in California, and he kind of released a lot of documents on the sort of spying programs in Muslim communities that had been happening. And they kind of indicted themselves because they said, like, well, it kind of got buried at the time because all the liberals, like, were so excited about, like, this was Mueller's FBI, basically. And they were, like, in love with him, and he was so great. So, like, that all got brushed. Like, it wasn't important, like, what the FBI was doing, like, just, like, destroying people's lives. Like, in the words of the FBI agent, the whistleblower, he said, like, I helped destroy people, over nothing. Terry Albury was his name. And the article said, the FBI swore people to secrecy, and they had a secret set of rules that they applied that weren't the ones that they applied publicly. And, like, they're a very large organization, but it took, like, this guy. I mean, I guess he did blow the whistle, and it was revealed. But in a way, like, people don't even know about it because until now, no one wanted to talk about it because the most important thing was, the white knight Robert Mueller bringing down, Orange Man, etc. Who
can you trust if not the first cousin once removed of Richard Bissell, the architect of the Bay of Pigs and potential co-conspirator in murdering JFK? Yes. Who can you trust if not him?
Yes, but it's ridiculous. Clearly, like, the whole idea, like, you can't keep a secret. These organizations can't do anything privately. Like, I always point to the Tuskegee experiment, which, like, went on for, like, decades and decades.
40
totally, like, before being revealed. Yeah, exactly. One thing that, like, really jumped out at me in reading about Jonestown to prepare for this episode was the way that, like, what eventually happened with, the revolutionary suicide and the Kool-Aid. I guess, actually, it was Flavor Aid, right, that was supposed to have been consumed. But it's interesting how, like, so much of that feeds into, like, kind of not only, like, are the theories around Jonestown's kind of written off as part of the larger superstructure of, like, the conspiracy, like, the quote-unquote conspiracy theory discourse, but also, like, what happened was a great, like, psyop against, like, left-wing movements. And particularly, like, something that Jim Jones would always preach was he hated religion. He would go on and on about how awful religion was and how terrible it was for the left, and particularly interestingly, to me personally, he hated the Nation of Islam. Like, he would make overtures towards them and try to kind of usurp them, especially during the leadership crisis that happened after Malcolm X's death. He was very big on Farrakhan and very down on Warith Deen Muhammad, but, like, behind the scenes, he would always be talking shit about them, like in the tapes, like, that we have the transcripts. Like, he hated religion. But it's interesting that, like, now it's like, oh, this is where, like, this kooky religious stuff, like, leads for left-wingers, like, this is where it goes, like, and it's, this is where, like, the Nation of Islam ultimately led, like, all that stuff, and, black nationalism, et cetera, like, but, of course, he was not an organic part of that, I think, I would conclude.
No, Jim Jones started out as a very, very right-wing person, had been his whole life. I mean, he was boyhood friends with Dan Mitrione and stayed friends with Dan Mitrione, like, throughout his whole life until Mitrione got tortured to death. Mm-hmm. But Jones started out as this right-wing figure. He would organize votes for Richard Nixon, and then all of a sudden, he became a leftist. And when he became a leftist, he started getting introduced to all of these high-level people in the San Francisco area, including Willie Brown.
Yeah, all Kamala Harris's friends,
yes,
right?
Like, Kamala Harris, and who got
the
a
whole
warning not to
Getty
fly.
Newsom,
all those.
You said Willie Brown got a warning not to fly right before 9/11,
That's right? Which allegedly came from Condoleezza Rice, although who knows? But yes.
Really?
Yes.
Oh, wow. Okay, interesting.
Amazing.
Slick Willie.
Wow.
I mean, he was mayor of San Francisco. I grew up in the Bay Area, so I remember. Have a long memory of Slick Willie being the mayor there, and he really had a way of dancing between the raindrops his whole career, and he's very forthcoming sometimes when he says things like that on TV. I guess, wow, Condoleezza Rice told him not to fly. Oof. And then, of course, George Moscone, Harvey Milk.
Yeah.
Rosalind Carter, Jimmy Carter's wife, right?
Right. He got and he also received money to build this crazy thing out in Northern California, where he put children and elderly folks and people with mental health issues all in the same camp. And of course, he had no licenses. He had no qualifications whatsoever. And then he got put in charge of the housing of San Francisco.
Yeah, housing authority in San Francisco.
Like, what the hell is going on?
Very weird.
And it's very weird unless you understand that he's essentially a plant.
Yeah, and some kind of asset.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, as I pointed out in I think my zine, the guy who actually purchased the land out in Guyana was a CIA agent. His name is Blakely. I think it was George Blakely.
Oh, yeah. George Philip Blakely.
Yes.
Yeah. And was he British by birth?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay, and he was one of the white supporters of Jim Jones that had a lot of money and was from a wealthy family. And then, well, I mean, who knows? Maybe that's a cover story. But basically, he was a conduit for a lot of money to be basically donated to the People's Temple to help, and I guess to buy that land in Guyana, right?
Yeah, and to operate as something of a handler, maybe a George de Mohrenschildt type, if you're familiar with the Kennedy assassination.
Yeah, exactly. The White Russian oil man.
Yeah, but you keep an eye.
Wasn't his nephew like college roommates with George H.W. Bush or something?
Yes, because Bush,
something like that.
Yeah, when Mohrenschildt allegedly killed himself with a shotgun right before he was being called to testify, he wrote a letter to George Bush frantically asking him for help. He said,
it's around the same time too, right? 1977, 78?
Yeah, 77, 78, right around the time that all this stuff is happening.
So I mean, there was because I think this would come back a little bit later. Maybe we dive into some of the other personalities involved in the actual Jonestown massacre. But this was still kind of an interesting era, was it not? For a certain level of the CIA was a little bit back on its heels, and there was a lot of investigations in Congress. There was the Church and Pike committees. Of course, there was Congressman Leo Ryan from San Mateo, which is interestingly, he was the congressman representing Silicon Valley in the 1970s. I don't know if there's any significance to that, but he ended up what was it, the Hughes-Ryan Amendment he co-sponsored, which forced the CIA to disclose any upcoming covert operations to Congress, which they very much did not like. And of course, this is also right after George H.W. Bush had been CIA director and then was fired by Carter, replaced with Stansfield Turner, and he in turn fired, 800 CIA officers,
about
career
800
guys?
CIA that were all had too many foreign ties, basically, that they were either first or second generation immigrants.
Okay, interesting.
Yeah. And so when Bush was put in as a CIA director, that's pretty interesting in itself, because William Colby had been cooperating with the Church Committee to an extent that made people very upset. So he got fired, and he's replaced by George Bush. And at the time, what's funny is that Bush allegedly has no ties whatsoever to the Central Intelligence Agency. So why is he becoming the head? And why does everybody agree that this is a great choice? Well, if you read the transcriptions of the Watergate tapes, I think it's Haldeman. I'm going off of memory here, but they say they're talking about who they can get to do this particular thing, and the guy says, "Oh, just get George Bush to do it. He'll do anything we tell him."
Wow,
which is very funny.
Interesting.
Yeah. I always tell people,
and at that time, I don't know, what was he, ambassador to China or something?
That's a good question. What his
at that time
role was?
He just like Rumsfeld, who I think Rumsfeld might have been the ambassador to what was it, to NATO or something? He was the representative to NATO, and he got sent out of the country right before Watergate hit. And then George Bush, I think, was maybe the UN ambassador and the ambassador to China right around the time that we were opening and kind of doing the the sort of Nixon Mao, rapprochement, and then so he was out of the country as well, and then got to swoop back in, and then that's when you saw like Cheney, Gerald Ford, who was on the Warren Commission, Donald Rumsfeld, and then they brought in George Bush as the CIA guy, and we brought it up before here, but there was that memo that was accidentally uncovered, I think in 1988, that was written, I think either to or from J. Edgar Hoover the day after the Kennedy assassination, which reported on 2 FBI agents going and briefing Mr. George Bush of the Central Intelligence Agency and asking him some questions about anti-Castro Cuban groups. And there was this whole thing in the 1988 presidential campaign where George Bush is like, that's not me, there must be another George Bush. And they apparently found like a janitor named George Bush who had worked at Langley but only in like 1963. And then like after the JFK assassination, he worked for some other federal agency, and he was like asked to transfer to Langley to be a janitor. And then after JFK assassinated, he was like transferred back out and is like, I was like a janitor, I never saw anything. So it's almost like they found another guy named George Bush to like put on payroll as like a backup if they ever. It's just so bizarre. And like, so basically, the theory going with that,
I mean, why would you be talking to the janitor about anti-Castro Cubans? Like, and why would J. Edgar Hoover need to be briefed about that? Like,
I mean, unless you're talking to the guy who owned the Zapata offshore oil company when Operation Zapata, which was, I believe, the code name for the Bay of Pigs, was being planned, and all of his like Yale, Skull and Bones, Ivy League buddies and social contemporaries were at the JM Wave Station in Miami. I mean, it goes back a ways. I actually found in 1844 that I believe that the grandfather of George H.W. Bush and the grandfather of the Dulles brothers actually were in the same graduating class of Yale in 1844. So, like, just think about, that's a whole nother level that people don't even think about, of like, these families have known each other and been in powerful positions in back and forth between the government and business for over a century, even before the Cold War starts. So then, the idea that like there can't, and these guys, I think Pynchon pointed out in Bleeding Edge, like, you think this isn't possible, but the people that staff these agencies are like high WASPs, Mormons, and like people of that nature, or I guess maybe at lower levels like Jesuit trained, that are almost like by nature extremely secretive, that if anybody's going to be able to sustain a conspiracy of more than 50 people, it might be them. And, maybe they've been raised from birth not to run their mouth. And on top of that, you have like the actual compartmentalization of the agencies themselves, which like does not freely, it's not like you just go on the CIA computer or whatever it was and just like pull up any information you want. It's all stovepiped, right? Like it always has been that way. And so it allows for more sinister collusions, perhaps.
Yeah, and if you go back to like somebody like Gustavus Myers, he was writing about this stuff at the time. There is a tradition in the United States of an aristocracy that is not. It doesn't have to do with England in a monarchical sense, but being from England is very helpful. If your family was one of the first families to come over, that gives you a certain authority, which is very peculiar, because if you look at the United States and you try to chart out racially who's at the top and who's at the bottom are the people who were here, like the natives, and the slaves that were brought over. And the top are the people that have the most ties, the most blood ties to Great Britain.
Yeah. Yeah, and to a lesser extent, like the Dutch as well, like
and the
patroon class of New Amsterdam. Yeah, I mean, you look at the Roosevelt
Well, when
family,
you can get both, when you have the Anglo-Dutch connection, all the better.
The first, conquerors coming in the 15th century to Guyana were Dutch, because at that time there were Dutch colonialists at that time. Oh, yes. And that was one of the things, part of the reason that I did that Jonestown zine, I like to bring attention to Mae Brussel, and in this case to Robert Cutler, who did a lot of tremendous work on the case. But also, I like to put in the stuff that they were not able to do, which is to show the 500-year history of Guyana before all this stuff happened, in which you can see that this area is full of rich mineral resources, which are very difficult to extract. And there have been attempts over the hundreds of years to try and get a population there to get that stuff out and get it to the countries that matter, quote unquote. And so I talk about how one of the peculiar things about Guyana today is that the two largest populations in Guyana are not native to Guyana. They were blacks that were imported from Africa and Indians that were imported from East India.
Wow.
Which is, extraordinary. And it's because of slavery. And furthermore, one of the things that developed in that several hundred-year period is that there was class warfare that came about because the indentured servants from East India had a slightly higher level of living than the African slaves that were brought in. And there were two political parties that emerged out of those two forces that were combating with one another over the same tiny slice of pie, right?
Wow.
Yes.
So it works in all these colonial operations.
Yeah,
yes, I remember
that
Jim Jones even mentioning in one of his, his ham radio transcripts about, trying to want to organize the different religious groups, bring together the different religious groups, because it really is like very diverse, has large populations from a bunch of different religions because of that history, like there's a large Hindu community and a large Muslim community, similar to Trinidad in a way, where you can, I think there's even like observances of Muharram in a form in Trinidad due to, the presence of Indians there historically. But yeah,
definitely,
it's a unique place. Yeah.
And studying those places also gives you perspective, I think, because you start thinking about these things not in terms of conspiracies, but in terms of colonial operations. So once you understand that that's the outlook that we're dealing with, it becomes a lot easier to understand current events.
Yes, and usually it really is like, it's interesting, they'll kind of say this in like a patronizing way where it's like, oh, it's the oppressed people of the world who believe in these conspiracies because they need it, like they're so afraid of things that they need to reach out for these irrational conspiracies. But like, no, it's just like grounded in experience that these things happen, like deliberate attempts to destroy like social institutions, to destroy societies, like, the destruction of Locke comes to mind. It's interesting the sort of racial or imperial dimension of that discourse, the conspiracy discourse. I mean, even in something we were talking about recently, the memo by Cass Sunstein and Adrian Vermeule on conspiracy theories, points out like, why is it that these Muslims believe so fiercely in these conspiracy theories? Like, what's going on? What's wrong with them? And I think they even acknowledge like there's a certain role like of the actual like political events of the actual like historical dimension to this, but they obviously don't really, they get very close, but they don't go all the way to draw the obvious conclusion.
Yeah, but like, how often do you hear about that?
That they're epistemologically crippled. Yeah.
Yeah, like they have to acknowledge it to like write that paper, which ultimately talks about like infiltrating online conspiracy communities to cognitively disrupt them. But they do mention that the majority of the people in like the Arab world believe that 9/11 was an inside job, like basically, and like a pretty comfortable majority, and so I think it's a particular kind of American like chauvinism to try to like, whether you're a liberal academic or whatever, to like really try to do some mental gymnastics to come up for a not offensive reason for why nobody fucking trusts America, and it totally finds it believable that they would do such a thing. And yeah, it ends up having to like kind of like psychopathologize them on a mass scale. And just like they used to say about communists, were like, oh, it's like an infection of the mind, like it's an ideological plague that's like seeping in your, like we can't make Paul Robeson wear a face mask or else he's going to spread communism when he sings to the crowd of workers.
It's interestingly very similar to like things that Jim Jones would say about like people, who he had disdain for, often religious people. He would say that it was, the people who believe in the Bible or something like that who weren't truly good socialists or something. I was reading one crazy transcript where he goes on about two Palestinians who hijacked a plane. I don't really trust his analysis of the event, but he's like, they were threatening to crash into the ocean, and they said that, there would be sharks in there or something. And he's like, no socialist is afraid of sharks or something, and it like went on this long rant about how life is cancer and like, the only cure is death. And that's what true socialism is all about. And it's like, obviously has nothing to do with like any of that, but like the rhetoric around like people's beliefs and like his socialism was like this twisted, like bizarre, warped ideological mirror of like the idea of what those people's beliefs are in some way. And that's what he preached as well.
So you're saying,
it was almost like
I was just going to say, it just so happens then that Jim Jones reflects a point of view that happens to coincide neatly with, say, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And
exactly.
Dan Mitrione.
They have the exact same
views. To do
views.
the work were 80 to 90% black women.
Yeah. It hits a little different when you zoom out and see like, oh, look, most of the temple leadership is a bunch of white people, and then it's mostly black
and having
women
to
that
do
are like doing all the work.
penance by going out into the fields and things like that, and him being like, it might actually, maybe I'll go out in the field one day, it might come to that. And like, no, Dad, please, like, but yeah, his view, for instance, of like the Nation of Islam coincides like completely with what the FBI would believe. All the while, he's saying like, oh, the CIA is after us, blah blah blah, but
the CIA is in his back pocket.
Yeah, he seemed very knowledgeable. Yeah, he seemed very knowledgeable of their methodologies in a way. He did seem to have like his ear to the ground in terms of how they operated, kind of representing them as his enemy. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think I definitely want to talk in the second hour how I think it was mentioned earlier how like his vision of like religious socialism or whatever it was like a tremendously effective and kind of suspiciously convenient like shitcoating of the potential of those ideals in an American context, and how it just so happened that his his version of like socialism was almost like if a bunch of FBI guys like sat down and wrote their like most horrifying fever dream of like, black Stalinism or something like that it has all of like, it has these tells, I feel like, of almost like reading maybe the most anti-communist like interpretation of like what maybe, I don't know, the Soviet Union did, and then embracing that fucked up version that probably isn't fully true. And then, like, championing that as, like, true socialism, which kind of, I think, has a way of shitcoating. And then, of course, the way it all went down was, like, the ultimate shitcoating of, like, this is what happens if you try to build an alternative community or you try to combine socialism and religion.
It really is, like, what a MAGA boomer would think today of, like, Black Lives Matter or something. Like, it's run by a white guy, like, they're an evil terrorist, or, like, they're crazy. Like, wokeness is a religion, but... but it's interesting that, like, when he actually would preach, like, the things that he would say would be, like, that you need atheism, like, religion is awful. Like, he literally insulted Jesus. Like, he would say, like, things like that Jesus was, like, a loser who, like, got crucified, things like that. And he, like, and he would also say, like, we need to stop being so hateful. I mean, obviously, he was white. So it makes sense that he would say this, but he'd be like, we need to stop being so hateful towards white people, all the while being kind of in this like sort of weird, almost like black nationalist or like anti-white organization that sort of was also like promoting this helter-skelter vision of like, a white night where they would all poison food or something like that, or do suicide bombings.
That's an interesting parallel with like the Manson family, but like kind of from the other end. But kind of like, is he that different from Charles Manson at the end of the day? He hobnobbed with famous people,
Yeah, I mean, the Manson thing that's a more complicated thing to go into, because I tend to think of Charles Manson as more or less a victim more than anything else. I mean, he was clearly
kind of do too,
petty criminal, and he's involved in drug deals and stuff like that. But obviously, I used to tell people this, and they would just look at me like I was crazy. It's like Charles Manson is the most notorious serial killer who never actually killed anybody. And for people to unpack what that means, they'd have to look at the same thing, like, because at the time that Manson comes out of, they were having a real issue with tune in, drop out, with kids from wealthy families who no longer wanted to go to Stanford, who wanted to hang out in communes and, listen to music and make love, not war. And that's what Mae Brussell said, that the people who would come to hang out at her house were these teenagers who were not, it wasn't that they were homeless, it wasn't that they were poor. A lot of them came from these incredibly powerful and wealthy families, and they were rejecting the whole thing.
Interesting.
And so there becomes, and then Vincent Bugliosi
yeah.
invents a conspiracy theory about these events that occurred, the Sharon Tate murder and so on, which are very strange. I mean, the details of, and Bugliosi invents this whole story, which is incredibly successful, and everybody buys it. And it's successful even to this day, like you say. I mean, Tarantino just got finished making a movie that accepts all of it, hook, line, and sinker. It's amazing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that just jumps out of it. That's a really interesting point you made about I know Mae Brussell had said that. I'd heard on broadcast before that she felt like she didn't seem to be as cynical as she was about all these other things. That kind of like the rise of the hippie culture. She did feel like there was something kind of pure and kind of beautiful about it kind of earlier on, that like the first hippies she would be, because she lived in Carmel, which like was right by Big Sur and kind of like a thoroughfare for a lot of those people going up and down the coast. But she didn't seem to think like, oh, everybody that was a hippie from the beginning was like a CIA, MK Ultra kind of op. But of course, you had people like Tim Leary, who was like probably some kind of agent, and then everybody at Palo Alto, like the Grateful Dead, all those acid tests, and Ken Kesey and all that stuff. But I think in terms of like, that is an interesting point. And it even reminds me of things that like Pynchon has written, like Inherent Vice. You have like Mickey Wolfman, the real estate guy, technically Jewish, but wants to be a Nazi, the big real estate kingpin, who I think drops acid and has like kind of like a moral panic and decides that he wants to build a commune out in like the Nevada desert and give it all his money away for free. So he gets carted off to like this MK Ultra hospital in Ojai, where they basically like psyop him with like Cold War propaganda films to like get him back into the mode of being like a good capitalist. So, and then I think about Patty Hearst. I think about what's his name? J.P. Getty III, who was kidnapped. And when we did our episode about Andrew Getty's film, Khalid read that whole passage about how he was running around in Europe, kind of like flirting around with like left-wing causes. Kind of didn't seem like overly kind of into it, but was kind of flirting around with like being a hippie and just was not interested in like inheriting the Getty empire at all. Then he gets kidnapped in this like fucked up way. Patty Hearst also was like flirting with like lefty kind of things. I think didn't she go up to Vacaville hadn't she actually slept with Donald DeFreeze like before the whole SLA thing kicked off?
I don't know. I mean, I've read that before. I don't know if that's true. I think it's
maybe Revolution's End.
I think it is in Revolution's End. Which I think you're right, because Krasner was the one who told me to read that thing.
Okay.
I don't think it's an accident that DeFreeze and Charles Manson were both at Vacaville prison.
Oh, and Tim Leary too, for that matter.
And Leary,
all these other serial killers. Yeah, so it makes me wonder, like, is that how these like aging like patriarchs back in the 70s during this like tumultuous period decided to like get their children and grandchildren in line, like make an example of them or something? Like, this is what happens to you if you start flirting around with.
You've read McGowan stuff, right?
Oh yeah.
So
like weird scenes inside the canyon.
Yeah, I mean, at a certain point, the establishment has to maintain control over the youth, and maybe they seed some folks to get them to do it. I mean, it sounds crazy without context.
Yeah.
But if you understand the context, then it starts to look not so crazy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This world has hope again. Because of this world has got a good friend.
Out of the voice of Jesus himself. Jesus was away shore to teach people how to live, to get their head out of the sand or out of the sky. He said, don't pray to go to heaven. And even Paul said, don't look up to go to heaven. He said, the righteous faith saith on this wise, the word, heaven, God, is nigh thee, even in thy mouth and in thine heart. Don't say who will go up to heaven and bring him down, or who shall go into the deep and bring him up from the grave? But what saith it? The word is within thee. Heaven is on earth. That's the only heaven you'll find. God is here. That's the only God you'll know. Make yourself God, the 10th chapter of John. And he said, it is written, all of you are gods. He said, I'm no different than you. Everybody's a God. So Jesus is God. I am God. You are God. That if it is time for me to lay down my body, I will, but all the king's horses and all the king's men cannot bring me down until the time has come. Listen, all ye scoffers and poisoners, we're feeling good in the house of Jones today.
In our last part here, Joe, maybe if you could, I don't know, maybe really quickly walk us through what you believe, to the best of your research, actually happened in the Jonestown massacre.
I think we've touched upon it a little bit, which is that Jim Jones is somebody who is clearly a person of interest to the Central Intelligence Agency and the whatever you want to call the military-industrial complex, I suppose, which is shown by the fact that he was a friend of Dan Mitrione, and Dan Mitrione, who was extremely notorious. And his job primarily was to train police departments in other countries how to torture the people who were trying to start revolutions, exporting COINTELPRO tactics, particularly in Latin America. And whenever Mitrione would go to one of these places like Brazil, for example, Jim Jones would also go. So let me take my buddy, Jim. And
sure.
The CIA actually purchases the plot of land in Guyana, which we've known for hundreds of years. People have been trying to exploit it in the same way that we've exploited other parts of Latin America, and unsuccessfully. And then at a certain point, Leo Ryan gets onto it because of, actually, ironically, because of Timothy Stone. Timothy Stone was probably the key figure in introducing Jim Jones to Harvey Milk and Willie Brown and Rosalind Carter and all these different people, and getting him embedded into that sort of liberal democratic structure. And in fact, the Harvey Milk thing is fascinating because Harvey Milk wrote a letter called In Defense of Jonestown when Timothy Stone's parents became upset that they weren't hearing from their son anymore, and got Leo Ryan's ear. And Leo Ryan took a plane to Guyana to find out what was going on because he wanted to know what was happening to his constituents. And that's where Leo Ryan was murdered. He was machine gunned to death on the tarmac, about 150 miles from Jonestown.
That was after visiting, right?
He visited.
He spent like an afternoon there.
And allegedly there was some sort of other attack that happened. Somebody tried to stab him or something, which Mark Lane got involved in that. Mark Lane was a big booster of Jonestown, as was Donald Freed, which, if you're familiar with this guy.
I was actually going to... I was going to ask about Mark Lane just as an aside, because he's somebody who's like very, I mean, you knew John Judge and, all these JFK assassination people. He's somebody who's still, I think, like highly regarded for his JFK assassination work. But what was up with him being involved in Jonestown? Because he survives the shooting on the tarmac and makes it out. And then, but like, I mean, I don't know. Do you think there's something sketchy about his involvement in Jonestown? Or did he get sucked into it by other people thinking that maybe this was actually like a socialist group that was being persecuted by the CIA? What do you think?
Yeah, going to get me in trouble again. Okay, well, I have talked about this before, so I guess I will again. Mark Lane, I do believe there was something sketchy, definitely about his involvement. It was actually Lane and Charles Gary. Charles Gary was a lawyer for the Black Panthers. They both survived the jungles of Guyana. Mark Lane said that he tore off his underwear and left pieces of it as a trail so that he wouldn't get lost. That was his story.
Wow.
I find it very hard to believe that Mark Lane didn't know what was going on in Guyana. There is one particular story that I talk about in the zine in which he was made aware that certain of the sandwiches had been filled with sedatives. And instead of letting the people know that we're doing the tour, he just decided he wouldn't have any sandwiches.
Yeah, that's right.
That is not the action of somebody who is on the up and up. And of course, if you know Mae Brussel, you know that Mae Brussel instantly had a dislike of Mark Lane. Did not trust him right from the start. I mean, I've gone back and forth with this over the years, and I've talked with many different researchers about this over the years. I find it very hard to believe that Lane's rush to judgment was not written in earnest. Even if I disagree with one thing or another, or he made a mistake here and there. I mean, everybody makes mistakes. But I don't know. John always thought that Lane had been a plant from the start. I don't know. I do know that by the time that he was Jim Jones's lawyer, I think we have to say that he was compromised. And I've argued in the past that Lane was compromised because there were things in Lane's record that made him compromisable. And if you look, you can find evidence of what I'm talking about. I won't say what it is exactly. But so that is that.
Well, I think that's a good
answer. It's very possible that that's what happened. But yeah, I've always found it suspicious that Mark Lane survived Jonestown and all those other people didn't. It
would almost feel like if he were totally sincere and thought it was one thing and got there, I don't know, either he would have acted differently or they would have killed him. Because didn't the shooters who showed up on the tarmac kind of went around execution style and had a very clear idea of who they wanted to execute and walked up and shot them in the head, right?
Yes. That's exactly right.
Yeah, including Leo Ryan.
Yes. And that's the other big issue with Jonestown, and that's the thing that John Judge wrote about in The Black Hole of Guyana, was that the Guyanese coroner, a guy named Dr. Mutu, the guy who actually examined the bodies, didn't really find any suicides. He thought that maybe one or two of the folks might have been suicides, but by and large, all those people were murdered.
Yeah, there were others shot, or they had like incision marks like between their shoulder blades, like they'd been injected forcibly, right?
Exactly. And so there, as far as and this is the guy that was on, like, he's the guy. He's the coroner. He has the medical expertise. He's the one who actually looked at the bodies. Now, what comes out of Guyana in newspapers all over the world, not in Guyana, is that all these people committed suicide. And that's what everybody believes to this day. So that, to me, is the key point, is that all of the available evidence at the time points in one direction. Every newspaper in the world and virtually every citizen of every other country in the world thinks otherwise. Why would that be the case?
Yeah. I don't know.
And they don't take the tack that they don't. In other words, newspapers in America didn't say, well, despite the Guyanese coroner saying this, we believe this. They just said, oh, everybody committed suicide.
Just like that, and everyone really believed it. I remember watching a kind of local, like, Cron TV, local Bay Area news report, like, right after the Jonestown Massacre, and I think they had Willie Brown on, maybe they had Dianne Feinstein, who, right after Moscone was assassinated, became the mayor, and then now she's the senator for, like, literally my entire life in the state, even though she's, like, very up there in years, it seems like nothing can, dislodge her, but like everybody was like hemming and hawing and just like, it did, like, obviously I think the amount of shitcoating it did on anybody that was like associated with him. I mean, you even had like Angela Davis and like Huey Newton and people like that a lot of people got sucked into supporting this thing, and then they had this egg on their face afterwards. But then it almost makes me like, oh, why couldn't Angela Davis or Huey Newton just come out and be like, all those people were murdered? But I guess then, I don't know, maybe some people, I don't know for a fact, but maybe some people did allege that, but they said that Jonestown was still a kind of legit project that was murdered, not that it was a horrifying like CIA mind control experiment that was wiped out.
Well, and you have to
basically got exposed.
You have to put yourself in the mindset of those folks at that time, which, you know, they don't have the internet, right? So they don't have access to all this information going in all directions. What they have are what the major newspapers are telling. So even if they have whispers, like even if they talk amongst themselves, like, geez, what was going on at that place? They don't have enough information to really go out and start taking a stand. And they're already both in big trouble because of COINTELPRO. So do they really want to wait?
Which is such an irony.
That much more heat on themselves.
Exactly. Exactly. So, okay, because I listened to a little...
Definitely something very, entwined with that. Do you think that they were all murdered, or, you know, like only a negligible proportion of them committed suicide? It does stick out to me that, like, they were really all about dying from, like, the transcripts that we have. I mean, maybe that could be part of, like, the illusion, but...
I was just going to ask, actually, in relation to that, because I was listening to the Transmissions from Jonestown podcast. I don't know if you've listened to it. I've heard both good and, like, later on, like, not so good things about it, but... I noticed that in the episode about the death tape that there's some people did speculate, like, what do you think about the death tape in the sense of, do you believe that tape was from that night, like just preceding the murders, or do you think maybe there was some kind of switchery, because they did a lot of suicide drills right on the white night, things like that. So it could have been like could it have been like a rehearsal that was then spliced over, you know, whatever tape was on the last night to present a certain narrative? Or do you think he was there actually telling everybody to commit suicide, but then off camera? I mean, when you listen to it, you know, if there's 1,000 people there, you can hear there's like a crowd with him, but it's kind of unclear like how many people really are there. So I don't know, maybe if you wanted to like split the difference, like, okay, maybe there's like 100 or 50 or something of like the really, really hardcore believers that are still kind of like, for whatever reason of abuse and conditioning and cult programming, whatever, like are kind of bought into this, but then like the majority of the camp is out there being like, what the hell is going on? You know what I mean? Like, so I don't know. What do you think?
Well, so here's the thing. I don't really I don't like speculating about photographs, audio tapes, or video, right? When I don't know what the hell's going on. So when I listen, I'm listening to those tapes, those possibilities are all there. And you also have to remember that when people arrived at Jonestown, they were immediately tied up and beat up. Like that was the first thing that happened to them. So if you have a bunch of guys with automatic weapons lining up people and saying, chant this, then they're going to do that probably.
Sure.
Right? So, but as to what was actually happening, I don't know. But what I do know is that the coroner found that there were only, at best, a handful of suicides, and that he found 900 murders. So, I mean, I can't do better than that. You know what I mean?
No, it's true. That's true. And I mean, that is the most important thing at the end of the day, regardless of what like Jim Jones was saying, like if the forensic evidence to the extent that it still exists. And they also, it's like the U.S. government like really went out of its way to like not preserve the bodies and collect them and let them basically sit out in the sun for days, right? Until they started bloating and then there's also, of course, the big weird thing is that they initially announced 400, and then the body count like miraculously more than doubled, and they said it was because they found the bodies of children and smaller women underneath like the bodies of the men, but that just doesn't seem numerically possible.
That appeared in major newspapers that they had trouble counting, but if you look at the available photographs, it does not appear that any of the bodies are on top of the other bodies to any extent that would cause any sort of confusion.
I feel like there's no way that, like, even if you had 900 people, like, you would notice that there were bodies underneath the other bodies, like, if you were doing counting. But, I mean, did the coroner really, like, I mean, Yeah, I don't know. I feel like, because one thing that sticks out to me is I feel like, he did, if I recall correctly, say that there was poison there, there was poisoned punch. And it does stick out to me that they did. I mean, people could have been forced to take it too, that's like people could have been like forced at gunpoint to drink this potion. And it does stick out to me, like, from the tapes, like, just how much they would talk about doing this, like, beforehand. It's odd. I mean, it seems like you would be able to get at least some of the people to do it.
Oh, especially if you did it as a fake drill, which is so psychologically abusive. But you basically did it multiple times. It was like, we're all dying now. Everybody drink your punch, and then everyone did, and was like, well, that's just a test of loyalty, and you all passed. Like, so maybe some people, I could see the psychology of that kind of working of like, well, maybe he's just joking again. Like, maybe this is just another loyalty test, basically. Even though it seemed pretty dire at that point. And
I feel like the element of the mass suicide has to be part of, like, the MK testing that's being done. Like, that's like such, I feel like it must be like a crux of it in a way. Like
it's part of the reporting. It's part of the story.
Yeah.
I don't think it necessarily has to be the cause of anything. I don't, and I sort of don't think it matters that much. To me, it's like, when JFK researchers start debating how many guys were shooting at the president. Like, I mean, what difference does it make?
Yeah. Well, in the abstract, it's murder anyway, because like they were like brainwashed to commit suicide or deceived into it or whatever. Like, in the abstract, it doesn't really matter at all. But I do find the idea of the appeal of like the ultimate mind-controlled soldier, the Manchurian candidate, that's like the holy grail of someone who will sacrifice their life, and that is such a big emphasis that comes through in these transcripts of like, the idea of like, I will kill myself, that is like a very valuable thing to be able to convince someone to commit, that's their life. You see it kind of played out in similar ways in later events like Heaven's Gate, which I feel like might have like a similar component, like to not to the same extent, but I feel like there might be some similar sus stuff.
Who
like
rented a house
from
the FBI informant that also rented apartments to two of the 9/11 hijackers.
Yeah.
Coincidentally,
they don't reinvent.
But I do get what you mean, though. Like that maybe in a sense that since they were willing to do, they were drugging them there, they were subjecting them to torture and all these other control things. That I wouldn't put it past to them, certainly morally, to make this like if it's just like how Candy Jones, the supermodel that claims to have been hypnotized to become like kind of a CIA spy, like basically she had a certain programming that like if she ever started to kind of like realize, or the control broke down, or she tried to get away from her handlers, they could somehow put her in a hypnotic state and then get her to commit suicide, like a self-destruct button. So maybe in a sense, like they had those vats of cyanide around to see, well, maybe that was the final experiment in a way. Though, you could just as easily see them trying to do that and then it not working. Like even with all that control, there were a lot of people that just didn't want to do it.
Oh, and I'm sure that is true. Even on
then they had to murder most of the people.
Even on the death tape, that does seem to be the case. But I definitely agree with you, Joe, that like regardless of this, like the value of it as like a story, the value of the idea that all these people committed suicide is like independent of like whether how many people actually did. Like there is like such a utility to that narrative that has a political effect. In the same way, the narrative of like, oh, Muslims killed Malcolm X, et cetera, the same type of stuff that Jim Jones would talk about. Like to his followers to sort of shitcoat other black leftist movements or black anti-imperialist movements.
No, that's a perfect analogy, and that's I wrote about that, and I did a review of the Malcolm X documentary that came out on Netflix, and where it completely avoids talking about anything other than being murdered by fellow Muslims. And it's like, guys, there's this whole other thing that everybody's missing.
It's very interesting how Jim Jones is so obsessed with that narrative and repeats it so often as like, a way to attack the Nation of Islam, even though he's obviously partial to Farrakhan and trying to shore up alliances with him. Farrakhan, who later was into Dianetics, or now is into Dianetics and stuff like that. Yeah, it's certainly interesting that, to see like how much of these, stories that, it's interesting how, he's the ultimate like crazy conspiracy theorist. He talks about how he's the target of conspiracies and things like that, but a lot of what he says is like, actually stuff that the bunkers would say today, like that, these Muhammadans, who believe in God, like they're crazy and they're all killing each other or something, Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and even also like his. I'm reading one of the quotes from his transcripts, Khalid, that you sent to me of him talking about basically MK Ultra. And it's so weirdly ironic. I'll just read the little quotes here where he says, these days when America's house is on fire and we are in grave danger, now we stumbles over blah, 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 $300. We don't like to sacrifice, but it's a worthy investment. If we could do anything to stop what they've got in mind here in California, you give us a little more time to get ourselves together so we can get out of here and get on our way when the bomb falls to get our way to protection, because they are now talking of experimentation. He kept saying UCLA, that's University of California. They've already done lobotomies there on people who really not sure the consent they got. He didn't portray it half as bad as it is. They're already doing chemicals, chemical therapy, altering with drugs in the prisons. Senator Ted Kennedy told us last week they're doing it in the feeble-minded institutions. They're doing it in the mental institutions. They're already doing this. It's not a matter of what will happen. So if we can get this man more money so we can try to influence some people to stop this, he's quite sincere, but he's a mistaken idealist. And he says, there's no use to talk about trying to stop this altering of the mind with drugs. There's no use to talk about brain surgery being stopped until we get these fat capitalists off the scene. Until the money mongers are off the scene, they will always be dealing with the minds, altering the human behavior, because what they want is every black person to go on as a slave, and they're trying to give them passive drugs, passive surgery that will dissect by incision and by chemistry, introduction of drugs to alter their behavior so that they will not question the dirty, stenching, smelling ghettos that they're living in. They will not quarrel with the fact that they're making half the wages of the white person. They will not quarrel with the fact they're sent over to Vietnam to fight the rich man wars. They're trying to get a whole breed of automatons of people that will move as you. You heard him mentioning here. The doctor recommends they put a monitoring device inside the brain and from a central office give them signals or relay signals of what their behavior is. This is horrendous. I mean, it's like I kind of don't disagree. Yeah, I mean, but it's like he's talking about Jolly and West. And, William Joseph Bryan, the guy who maybe programmed Sirhan and Vacaville Prison, and the what was it, like the Commission for the Prevention of Violence that Reagan and his goons were trying to get started with Jolly West in California at like a Nike missile base. To take like young juvenile offenders and do like psychosurgery on them and all this crap. So he's talking about it, but it's kind of like Lyndon LaRouche. Like then, he's also like kind of participating in it at the same time. So like, man, what the hell? I don't know. Like, is this the deeper level of COINTELPRO?
Yeah, no. And so that's the thing, right? And that was one of the first things that John would tell me, and he would remind me, is like anybody who is an infiltrator is telling 90% of the truth, right? Because otherwise there'd be no reason to listen. The reason that you're interested in this person is because they're speaking 90% of the truth, but it's the 10% that's going to get you. So a lot of the disputes that happen in the conspiracy world, right, have to do with where you stop your research. So there are people in the Kennedy thing who think that Lyndon Johnson killed the president, period. It's Lyndon Johnson's thing. Mm-hmm. And when you investigate it, to me, that seems very implausible, that LBJ is the center of this assassination, right? It's not to say he's not involved. It's not to say he didn't know about it. There's all kinds of arguments we can talk about. But to say that he's the prime mover doesn't really make sense to me. And it also doesn't make sense in the context that we're talking about, which is a context of colonialism. Because all of this power stuff goes into these moves. And it sounds crazy, except when you read COINTELPRO documents, they're very specific about what they're trying to prevent, right? We don't want a black messiah. They specifically want to get rid of Martin Luther King. They want to get rid of Malcolm X. I mean, they're putting it on paper, like what they want. And it just so happens that it happens, by some magical, mysterious force. But I think that you have to take all this stuff into account and not get married to any one particular theory and say, well, the lizard men did it, and so the lizard men did that, and they did this other thing. It's not the way it works.
Yeah, because I mean, I think
and
there's
one of
a
the
way
most
of looking.
effective way, I think, to deflect like suspicion from oneself is to point the finger at it's funny reading Jim Jones talk about like they're a CIA front, about all about everybody under the sun, and of course, he's going to say that. And part of the reason why he's so knowledgeable, it's interesting, reading the diaries of the temple members. They're all reading books, like I assume under his, recommendation, or certainly not against his recommendation, about the CIA and about their conspiracy, like the CIA and the Cult of Intelligence. I think Ellen Roller was reading, So of course, it makes perfect sense. I think that he would be sensitive to that and almost is the beam in his own eye, the whole time. Yeah,
absolutely. And the other angle to that, in terms of really mind fucking the left in America, is kind of their overtures to the Soviet Union. That was something I wanted to ask you, Joe, about what you kind of make of that. I feel like I read something, maybe it was something from Pravda, maybe it was on the John Judge website. What do you make of kind of the contacts and the relationship, such as it was, between Jonestown and the Soviets, because they were talking at one point about maybe we'll go and start we'll move to the Soviet Union as refugees and start a commune out somewhere. But I don't know, what do you got on that?
I mean, it's certainly, it makes sense in terms of the Defense Department floating different ideas of what they want to do. So, as you know, the DIA, right, the Defense Intelligence, one of the other points that JJ used to point out all the time is that the DIA has 9 times the budget of the CIA, and it's completely secret. They war game all kinds of stuff, right? And I've made a joke about it before. If we ran our lives like the Defense Department, we would draw up all of these detailed plans about how to murder our neighbors in the event that we had to do it, right? Which is true. That's what they do, right? There's somewhere in the in the Defense Department, you will find a paper called how do we invade Canada and kill everybody in Canada?
Yeah, War Plan Red, right? Yeah, right.
So, not to mention continuity of government, Rex 84, and all that fun stuff.
Right. The Senator anyway, gavel banging. Stop talking about this. If you've seen that video, So a lot of this stuff is, I feel like that's certainly a possibility. Somebody might have said, well, maybe we can figure out, we can turn, Jim Jones can be a spy for us in the Soviet Union, or maybe we can get them involved in this and make them look bad. I do think that part of what's going on with the Jim Jones thing is it is part of the design, or maybe it's just a lucky accident, is to make the left look bad. And one of the things that I think is so fascinating is that when Harvey Milk gets killed, the story is that this, crazy guy, who was sexually frustrated or whatever, had his issues, killed Harvey Milk. The story was not Harvey Milk is killed within 9 days of Jonestown.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And it just so happened that Milk has these ties to Jonestown. He's getting money funneling into Jonestown and publicly defending it in writing.
Wow.
So I do think that part of that is,
There's something about Milk, we discovered recently, I wasn't aware of this, but you remember when Gerald Ford got shot at twice in 1975 when he was visiting Northern California? Once by Squeaky Fromm, a former member of the Manson family, and then again by Sarah Jane Moore, who was a woman who had become obsessed with Patty Hearst and had volunteered to work on whatever the grocery program was that they set up for the SLA, and actually almost would have killed. She barely missed taking a shot at Gerald Ford, but I guess she had gotten a new gun that morning and hadn't adjusted the sights, and it was a couple inches off, and then a guy tackled her, and then that guy the next day was outed as gay by Harvey Milk to the San Francisco Chronicle, and I'd never known any of this story before, but it was it kind of ruined his life a little bit. I mean, it wasn't really good for him, and it was like kind of without his permit, definitely without his consent. Harvey Milk just decided to kind of out him and be like, well, this shows that, like gays aren't just, sickos in bathhouses, and, we could also like save the president from an assassin. But it seems like this guy definitely didn't get like a medal or anything, and like didn't get good things coming. It was almost like he interrupted something that he maybe shouldn't
saving
have.
The president. Yeah, he said that he regretted doing it. Like he regretted driving the gun. Yeah, because his life
weird,
like his parents disowned him and everything when he was outed.
So was Harvey Milk being like, was he just being a little too eager and maybe a little bit like selfish by like, I'm going to politicize this guy's like actions and whatever, regardless of what happens to him, or was it like, I don't know,
was he
like
punishing the guy who saved Floyd's life? Yeah, I don't know.
A little bit. I don't know.
You pull on the threads.
Yeah,
I mean, but
it is weird.
It's what I encourage people to do all the time is like pull on the threads of some of this stuff, because you start to look at all of these, even attempted assassinations, you start coming up with all kinds of crazy things. And you can also start to map out some of the similarities between the assassins. They often come into a lot of money.
Oh, yeah.
They do a lot of traveling right before they, try to kill their people. They're traveling on buses all the time from the different places. And sometimes they even work at the same place. Like, like John Hinckley and Mark David Chapman were both in World Vision, which is a CIA front.
Yes.
Allows them to go into other countries.
That's right.
It's you could write a whole book just on the attempted assassins, which I guess Mae Brussel kind of did in long form over a 20-year period. But yeah, no, that's absolutely right. You start to poke at all of these little different things, and you find all of this crazy stuff that's all underneath and is never reported in any substantive way in either newspapers or in history books written later.
Yeah, and then it gets into the groundwater of our culture and how we conceive of ourselves and like what our history is. So now that like saying like "don't drink the Kool-Aid" is just like a kind of a benign, funny phrase that is referencing like really a heinous lie, covering up a quite probable mass murder of mostly African Americans down in the jungle in South America. Yeah, and it's just like, oh yeah, and people just don't interrogate, or they'll say like, did you know? I've seen there was a book like recently that came out. I forget the author, but it was kind of highlighting how tight Jones was with like the liberal establishment. But it was written by like a more conservative author, so it was like, did you know that all these sicko liberals were just hanging out with this communist preacher, blah blah blah, and just kind of making it seem like, okay, yes, he was genuinely a communist, and also all these sicko liberals just like loved him, and that means they're sick, and blah blah blah, and kind of just even that's twisting it in away from the direction of like this guy had all these CIA ties, and he was just a wacky like BLM preacher who went insane, and it's just it's so weird. I mean, were there any other? I did want to ask you, are there any other churches in that era that were doing a mixture of like radical left politics and kind of like almost like tent revival, like Protestant Christianity?
Not to my knowledge, not tent revival. I mean, there's certainly Black liberation theology.
Yes, there is, and in Central and South America was there, but it was mostly Catholic.
Right. But as far as like revival tent radicalism, I mean, it's suicidal in a sense, because the Catholic Church has no interest in Reformation or Revolution.
Yeah. Yes, that's been made very clear.
It might affect their real estate holdings. I mean, so it's the wrong place to expect change, in my view.
Yeah. I was just, or maybe it was a kind of a reaction to the Nation of Islam and its influence in the Black community. That what if we did a kind of Christian version of this?
I think it definitely was a big part of it, and I think that I genuinely do think. I mean, it's quite obvious. Like if you actually like read through the transcripts and like read like what Jim Jones was saying about the Nation of Islam and his relationship with it, like it's just how interesting that like he just hated them and fought with them, and there were all these tensions. Like even in that famous book Raven, he talks about how like there's a quote from Jim Jones where he says like there were all these tensions, we could barely even walk down the street, but then like just when Farrakhan is taken over, then it's like, oh, we're going to be friends now. Like we're, our movement is coming together. But behind the scenes, of course, he's talking about how you're just sounding like, like a crazy frothing right-winger after 9/11, when he talks about Islam. It's interesting that he was able to, like, divert the, like, just right after Malcolm X dies, right after Martin Luther King dies, he's like, comes in, this white dude who's like, I'm God.
Yep.
And like has all these people calling him dad, and is able to divert. Like, there's this really sad transcript I read where this woman is like apologizing to him because, like, when her mom first told her about Jim Jones, she was like, you're calling this white man dad? And she's like, I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry, God. I'm sorry for question, because I realize that it's not about like your skin, it's about whatever, or, but like, which of course is wholly not like BLM black nationalist thing, that he would say like all the time, like, oh, it's not about the color of your skin, white people are also like oppressed. It's just, it's very, very convenient with like the deep investment, like you said, like, we don't want a black messiah, like, we ended up with like a white black messiah, like doing a mass suicide, and he also like is a communist, an open, like, fanatical supporter of the Soviet Union and red movements across the world. But he was telling like his congregation, while saying that he was God and like he had the true keys of the Bible, like just like talking about how awful religion was the whole time, but then like still it's so convenient because like afterwards it becomes a symbol of everything that is like awful about like the crazy cultic. He's a cult. Yes. It's a cult, and it's also
cult,
left wing.
Basically.
Perfect.
It was able to, I guess, move a little more swiftly through American culture by having like this classic Christian kind of face on it, but and it ended up just like sticking, shitcoating everything it came in contact with.
Yes, and contributes to the general premise of the Reagan America, basically, which is that if you were doing anything other than American things, which is to say doing what you're told, going to a job, going to the church you've been designated to go to, then you fall into this possibility, oh my God, how many television movies in the 80s were about cults? Oh my God, my daughter made a cult.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. All that stuff. It's we
talked about that before, like all the action movies and the cop movies, and I mean, and also like that was also happening, which is a whole nother weird level. But even that, I'm on my more paranoid side, I have read Dave McGowan, and I think about, why are there like these like cults and like serial killers that all were just like so like evil and like violent, whatever, just all happened in like the 70s and the 80s, and then it just sort of like fell off and like switched to other things. And like there's a million reasons you could probably interrogate for that, but when you look at even like Sirhan and stuff in like the late 60s and like people
who was in Amork, which is another weird thing about that, like the whole like subcultural, like religious, or not subcultural, but like subliminal, like religious dimensions, all this stuff is like very fascinating. The dialectic between like extreme kind of vulgar Marxist atheism and like the tent revival aesthetic in Jim Jones, and then like bringing that into the 80s with like the tension and the dialectic aspects of the Satanic Panic, which kind of like the rise of evangelicalism as like a political force, and like the quote unquote religious right, or the quote unquote Satanic Panic and the quote unquote religious right, and like bringing it up to today where we have the most satanic popular culture ever, and a very impotent left where these like ideas, and in fact we do see, like, I think, in my opinion, we do see like a blending between like, the dirtiness or the contamination of a quote unquote conspiracy theory, or an analysis of history that like indicts these forces like the intelligence community or things like this in a proper way, or actually like takes the experience of people of these predatory behavior seriously. That is kind of like seen as dirty and low and stupid in the same way that like, oh, those crazy fanatics who are going to chop off Charlie Hebdo's head, that's what it's all too scary and dirty, and it's bad for the left. So we just need to keep being like impotent and not do anything. I don't know, whatever. Like,
JJ used to quote Marty Schatz all the time. Marty Schatz wrote a book called History Will Not Absolve Us. And he says in that book that Americans are allowed to believe anything and to know nothing. Which cuts right to that.
Yeah. I mean, that's the California New Age kind of ethos, I think, in a nutshell to a certain degree. It's seeped into Silicon Valley, Hollywood, and everything else. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and the internet, I mean, double-edged sword, really. It's allowed us to look up all these resources in a much faster way, but it's also just, like, been a spigot of, like, disinformation also to make it even harder for people to, like, even get to a point of contemplating, something like
it's
this
a
not
pharmacon.
being what the media said.
Yeah, pharmacon.
Yes,
Pharmacon.
it is.
Poison is the cure.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah, exactly.
Guys, I apologize. I gotta go.
That's
Of
all
course,
right.
yeah, by all
It's a
means, it was great
perfect
talking
place
to
to
you.
end. Yeah, great talking to you, Joe. Thanks for coming
Yeah.
on. And we'd love to have you back someday to talk about some other topics. 'Cause I know you know so much about all these things.
That would be awesome.
Oh, yeah, real quick. If you want to give people a chance to tell them where you can find your work and stuff like that.
The easiest place to go is to go to Joe Green JFK. And from there, you can get to everything else. I have a small press, Say Something Real Press, and I'm affiliated with the Hidden History Center. And you can get all those links from Joe Green JFK.
Awesome. Awesome.
JoeGreenJFK.com, is that right?
Yeah.
And on Twitter, right?
And on Twitter. Yeah, same thing. Yeah.
Very cool. Very cool.
Very cool.
All right. Well, we'll let you get out of here, but thanks so much for coming by.
You bet. Dimitri and Khalid is a
until
lot
next
of fun.
Yeah, no, it was
definitely.
great. It was great.
Yeah, talk to you again.
Yeah. So until next time, dear listeners, stay vigilant.
Peace.
Take care, guys.
If we give them love, it will set us free, and we'll feel the joy that life was meant to bring. To give our all is not enough, you see. So let us give them love and set them free. He gave us all for us that day, but we failed to see just what we tried to say. We've misused his name to hide our guilt and shame. So let us give them love and set them free.
Love is the only weapon. Shit! Bullshit! Martin Luther King died with love. Kennedy died talking about something he couldn't even understand, some kind of generalized love, and he never even backed it up. He shut down. Bullshit! Love is the only weapon with which I got to fight. I got a hell of a lot of weapons to fight. I got my claws, I got compasses, I got guns, I got dynamite, I got a hell of a lot to fight. I'll fight! I will fight! I will fight! I will fight!
Now the end is near, and there's not much time to give to those who need a change of mind. The love they need will help us all to see. So let us give them love and set them free.
If you're Dimitri, you better be sure you know who you're dealing with. Because after we're all dead over here, you might go to a social party after you're trying to get your little reward, your little 30 pieces of silver for selling out the greatest people on earth. And you walk in with the Judas tribe, and the wife of Judas might be one of the ladies I'd laid to make a socialist.
As you
And she might give you slow poison in your champagne. You don't know how clever I am. One thing you've all done is underestimate me. I made plans for treason long ago because I knew I couldn't trust nothing. I knew I couldn't trust anything but communism and the principle in me, yes, Westfield. I knew that that's what I had to depend upon, not depend upon the arm of the flesh, and never put all your eggs in one basket. So, honey, I put my eggs in many places.
I want you to speak of
You figure that out if you want to.
and
You're too naive. You don't know what Jim Jones is all about. You can't even follow him. You haven't even smelled where he's at yet, much less followed him. You don't even know who he is, and you might miss him. If you didn't have a real good look at him, you wouldn't even know who he looked like. You really haven't got next to him, but I've got all kinds of things in store.
roll by. I want you to walk with your head held high. I want you to live by the justice code I want you to walk down